in a quiet corner of the earth, far from the noise of cities and the constant murmur of thought, a monk once asked his disciple, "When the wind stops and the leaves are still, who speaks within you?" The young disciple had no answer. Silence lingered between them like sacred incense. There are moments in life when words become too heavy to carry. We speak to fill the void, to cover discomfort, to chase away our own fear of stillness. But what if the real wisdom does not arise when we speak, but when we stop speaking? This story begins not with sound, but with the absence of it. It begins with a man who had everything and yet felt he possessed nothing. A king cloaked in gold, burdened by invisible chains of restlessness. Wealth lined his halls, but peace eluded his heart. One day, he left the palace behind and journeyed to a remote monastery, not for power, not for counsel, but for stillness. There, an old monk received him, not with advice, but with a challenge. Live in silence for 15 days, say only what must be said, observe the world without reacting, observe yourself. The king agreed. On the first day, silence was like a mirror he didn't want to face. But by nightfall, something subtle shifted, not in the world, but within. True silence had entered his mind, not absence of sound, but presence without noise. And so began his return, not to a kingdom, but to himself. The second morning rose with no fanfare, just golden light spilling through leaves, a bird's cry fading into stillness. The king awoke not to commands or servants, but to himself. There was no one to impress, no one to answer to, just silence, and the ever-present company of his own thoughts. He found that the noise he once blamed on the world had always lived inside his own chest. Thoughts rushed in like wild horses, regrets from battles fought, anxieties about the throne, grievances whispered behind royal walls. In the absence of distractions, these voices grew louder, but he did not speak. He sat beneath a tree, eyes open, watching a drop of dew cling to a blade of grass. He breathed deeply, then deeper still. For the first time, he realized how unfamiliar he was with the rise and fall of his own breath. How often had he lived without truly being alive? By evening, something shifted again. The storm inside him grew quiet, not because it ended, but because he stopped chasing it. He watched his mind like one watches clouds. No judgment, no resistance, only witnessing. And in that sacred watching, a door opened, not outward, but inward. That night, the stars above the monastery felt less like distant fires and more like ancient companions. The king didn't feel small beneath them. He felt part of them. The monk watched him from afar, smiling gently. The real teaching had begun. A silence louder than any voice had started to bloom inside him. The third day unfolded like a slow breath, quiet, steady, and full of unseen transformation. The king had stopped glancing toward the forest path where his guards once stood. He no longer missed the weight of his royal robes or the sound of people bowing in his presence. He missed nothing. Instead, he was beginning to listen to the wind weaving through the trees, to the gravel beneath his bare feet, to the subtle hum of life that he had ignored for years. These sounds didn't demand his attention. They invited it. In that quiet, he noticed something remarkable. His thoughts no longer collided in chaos. They moved like leaves carried gently by the current of a stream. The silence that once felt heavy now held him like a cradle. He ate without hurry. He walked without purpose, and yet each action felt full, sacred, as though the universe paused to breathe with him. At twilight, he sat near the edge of a small pond, watching ripples move outward with perfect calm. He saw his reflection, aged, tired, yet somehow softer. For the first time, he looked at himself without judgment. He didn't feel the need to fix or prove anything. He just was. That evening, as the bells of the monastery echoed into dusk, the king closed his eyes, not to escape the world, but to enter it more deeply. The monk, observing from the shadows, knew. The seed of awakening had taken root, and in stillness, the real journey was beginning. On the fourth morning, a fine mist embraced the trees, and the air carried a quiet stillness that touched even the smallest leaf. The king awoke before sunrise, not out of obligation, but because something inside him stirred with the rhythm of nature. He no longer waited for instruction. The silence had become his teacher. He followed it like a child walking beside a wise elder, curious, humbled, and ready to learn. He found a wooden bench near the monastery's garden and sat without intention. A butterfly landed on his knee. He didn't move. He simply watched. Time stretched. His mind no longer demanded answers. It was content with questions. Later, while sweeping fallen leaves from the monastery grounds, he noticed how each leaf fell in its own time, without struggle, without noise. The monk passed by and said, "To sweep the path is to sweep the mind. Don't rush it. Let the dust settle." The king bowed in silence. That sentence echoed in his chest like a bell, resonating deeper than any command he had ever given as a ruler. That afternoon he fasted, not because it was required, but because his hunger had shifted. He no longer craved food or approval. He hungered for stillness, for simplicity, for presence. That night, as candlelight flickered in his room, he whispered a sentence he had never dared to speak aloud. "I am learning to be empty." And in that emptiness, he felt something profound begin to bloom, something that needed no name. On the fifth day, the wind carried no message. It simply passed through the trees, stirring their branches like a gentle reminder that everything moves, even silence. The king walked barefoot along a narrow stone path. With each step, he felt the earth beneath him, solid and forgiving. His feet, once adorned with jewels, now touched the ground with reverence. In the kitchen, he peeled vegetables with an elderly monk who spoke only through smiles. There were no grand lessons, no sermons, only presence. The knife moved slowly, rhythmically, as if slicing through the noise within. Outside, a bird sang one clear note. The king paused. That single note lingered longer than 1,000 conversations. From his palace, it echoed through him as if it were asking, "Are you truly listening?" Later, while washing his bowl after a silent meal, he noticed the water shimmer under the afternoon light. He remembered how he used to feast among gold platters, yet never felt full. Here, with rice and boiled roots, he felt nourished, not just in body, but in spirit. At dusk, he returned to his room and sat cross-legged. There were no chants, no guided meditation, only his breath. Inhale, exhale, the sound of being alive. He noticed how each breath was different, yet familiar, like waves, never repeating, always returning. And in that breath, he whispered not a prayer, but a truth. The world is still the same, but I am beginning to change. That evening the stars came out slowly, as if bowing in agreement. The sixth morning arrived without announcement. The king awoke not to the call of servants or the rustle of silk sheets, but to the quiet breath of dawn and the distant call of a heron across the valley. He sat beneath the Bodhi tree at the edge of the monastery grounds. Its leaves fluttered in the breeze, each one a whisper from a deeper place. He had read many sacred texts in his life, but now he understood. Nature speaks in verses that no parchment can hold. A young novice came by and offered him tea without a word. They sat side by side, drinking in silence. The king noticed the heat of the cup, the scent of earth and leaves, and the way the steam curled like incense toward the sky. He did not feel above the novice. He did not feel beneath him. He simply felt present, level, equal. Later he watched an old monk sweep the garden path with slow, deliberate strokes. Dust rose and fell like memories, and the king thought, every movement can be a meditation. That afternoon he caught his own reflection in a pool of water. His face had not changed, yet something behind his eyes had softened. The sharpness of ambition had dulled into something gentler. Awareness. He smiled, not for anyone else, but for the self he was finally beginning to meet. As he closed his eyes to rest, he realized something profound. Silence does not empty me. It reveals me, and it invites me back to what I had forgotten. By the seventh day, the rhythm of silence had become a kind of song. The king no longer counted the hours. He no longer waited for something to happen. He simply allowed each moment to unfold like the petals of a lotus, slowly and without demand. He spent the morning walking barefoot along the forest's edge. Each step grounded him. Each sound, the crackle of leaves, the distant hum of bees, became part of a living symphony he had never truly heard before. There was no urgency in him, no need to prove, to acquire, to announce. The world in its simplicity felt whole, and for the first time, so did he. Inside the monastery hall, he noticed an inscription carved into wood. Listen more than you speak. Observe more than you assume. Breathe more than you strive. He read it once, then closed his eyes, letting the words echo in his breath, as if they had always belonged to him. Later, while tending to a small herb garden, he realized something startling. His thoughts had slowed, not because he was suppressing them, but because they had nothing to resist. Without endless speaking, his mind had nothing to defend. Peace had crept in, not through effort, but through surrender. He recalled the monk's words. It is not what you remove from life that brings peace. It is what you stop adding. And as he sat beneath the shade of a neem tree, he whispered within, perhaps I never lacked peace. I just drowned it with my own noise. On the 8th day, a gentle rain began to fall before sunrise. The king awoke to the sound of droplets dancing on the roof, a rhythm so soft and natural that it felt like the sky itself was meditating. He sat by the window and watched the water bless the earth, washing leaves, nourishing roots, and silencing even the smallest dust. Something within him softened. He remembered how he used to curse the rain, how it delayed his travels, ruined his celebrations, and kept him confined. But in this silence, he understood that it wasn't the rain that had disturbed him. It was the restlessness of his own expectations. What he once called interruptions were really invitations to slow down, to see differently, to feel more deeply. Later, while sweeping the monastery's stone path, he saw how the leaves gathered quietly in piles, without resistance. If only the mind could gather itself like this, he thought, without needing to scatter its energy through every conversation, every complaint. He paused by a stone statue of the Buddha, its face serene, eyes half closed in eternal stillness. The king knelt before it, not in worship, but in understanding. That stillness was not divine. It was simply undisturbed humanity, the natural condition beneath the noise. A novice monk passed by and smiled without saying a word. The king smiled back. No greeting was needed. In that glance, a teaching was transmitted. Sometimes presence speaks louder than voice, and as the rain continued to fall, the king closed his eyes and asked nothing of the day. He simply let it be. The 9th morning began without sound. No birds, no footsteps, not even the wind dared to stir. The king stepped outside, and it was as if the entire monastery held its breath with him. This absence of noise didn't feel empty. It felt full, like something sacred had entered the silence. He walked slowly past the meditation hall, where monks sat cross-legged in stillness, their eyes lowered, their breathing like invisible threads weaving the space together. The king didn't join them, but he paused at the entrance, simply observing. In their posture, he saw dignity, not from pride, but from presence. These were not people escaping the world, but returning to what the world had forgotten. They weren't running from chaos. They were listening for the quiet hum beneath it. That day, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. He peeled fruit with care, lit incense with reverence, and swept the garden path like it was a form of prayer. Every gesture was a sentence, every movement a verse in a sacred poem. By evening he sat under a tree and looked up. The sky was soft with dusk. What have I become in this stillness? He wondered. Not a king, not a monk, just a man rediscovering his own heartbeat. He felt no urgency to return to the palace. For the first time, he wasn't worried about duties, appearances, or opinions. He realized peace wasn't a place to reach. It was a rhythm to remember, one that had always been there, waiting in the hush between thoughts. On the 10th day, the king rose before dawn. A thin veil of mist hung over the temple grounds, softening the edges of all things. He stood barefoot in the dew-soaked grass, watching the sky slowly lighten. He had not slept much, but he felt no fatigue, only stillness, like a pool undisturbed by time. He remembered how his life used to begin. Servants rushing in, voices announcing duties, scrolls of responsibility unrolling endlessly before his eyes. But here, the day did not begin with noise. It began with awareness, sunlight brushing the leaves, the scent of wet earth, the silent discipline of monks already at prayer. Later that morning, the monk found him seated beneath a tree, lost in quiet observation. The monk didn't speak. He simply sat beside him. Minutes passed, like clouds, formless, drifting, without urgency. Finally, the monk said, "Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything else." The king nodded slowly, feeling the truth of it not as a concept, but as something known by the body. His thoughts no longer jumped like frightened animals. They moved like water, fluid and slow. He realized that his mind had always been busy, not because it was strong, but because it was unsettled. Now, in this silence, it was strong because it was rooted, anchored in the present moment. He turned to the monk and asked, "How long have I been asleep in my own life?" The monk smiled gently and answered, "You're beginning to wake up." There was a moment, just after sunrise, when the king walked alone through the monastery garden. The dew still clung to the grass, and the wind whispered softly through the bamboo groves. No attendants followed, no royal duties called. For the first time in years, he was simply a man among the trees. The air felt lighter, the colors richer, as though the world had paused to breathe with him. He sat beside a still pond, its surface smooth as polished glass. A single drop from a leaf above broke the silence, creating expanding ripples that danced across the water. As he watched, a realization unfolded from within. His thoughts were like those ripples, disturbed by every distraction, every word spoken without purpose. The pond never resisted the drop. It simply accepted it, then returned to stillness. He wondered, could his mind learn the same grace? Each breath felt more spacious, each moment more sacred. The king closed his eyes and listened, not to voices, but to silence itself. And in that silence, something began to speak, not in words, but in presence. It was the quiet voice of truth, which had always been there, patiently waiting for him to listen. Later that day, the monk approached him with calm steps. They exchanged no words, only a glance that held centuries of wisdom. The king bowed, not out of duty, but reverence. Together they sat, facing the garden. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of life. That evening, a light rain began to fall. The sound of droplets tapping gently on the tiled roof was like a rhythm, composed by the universe itself. The king remained seated in silence, watching the rain trace slow lines across the wooden floor of the meditation hall. In that still moment, he did not wish to be anywhere else. There was no palace, no throne, no noise of the world. Only this, quiet, unfolding now. He had begun to understand that silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of depth. It was the field where truth blossoms and the mind no longer chases shadows. He reflected on how often he had spoken just to fill the air, just to be heard, thinking that speaking meant control, that commanding brought peace. Now he knew silence was the greater mastery. As he walked slowly after the rain, he noticed the earth smelled richer, the leaves more vibrant, as if nature itself had been washed clean. The raindrops hanging on the branches shimmered like tiny lanterns, each one reflecting the world in its curved surface. He thought, "My mind was once this crowded sky. Now it begins to clear." That night, as he lay down to rest on his simple mat, his thoughts did not race. There were no arguments in his head, no voices of expectation, just breath, just stillness. In silence, he had found not only peace, but a deeper self, waiting quietly to be remembered. The morning came quietly, with golden light filtering through the paper windows. The king awoke before the bell sounded. There was no need for someone to summon him. His own spirit had risen before the sun, gently, as if called by something older than time. He sat upright, not out of duty, but out of inner pull, the way a flower turns toward the dawn. He walked to the meditation hall barefoot. Each step on the wooden floor felt sacred, as though he were walking across the surface of his own soul. In the center of the hall, he sat cross-legged, closed his eyes, and breathed. There was no expectation, no effort to reach enlightenment. There was only breath and the silence between breaths. That space. It stretched open like a vast field. In that openness, he began to see his past, not as a burden, but as a path. Every mistake, every regret, every word spoken in anger, they were not chains, but teachings. Silence had taught him to listen, not only to the world, but to the heart that beats beneath his words. He began to feel the seed of compassion quietly sprouting inside him. He understood now that wisdom does not shout. It arrives quietly, like the moon rising behind the mountains. It waits until we are still enough to notice its presence. A voice arose inside him, not a thought, but a knowing. You are not here to conquer the world. You are here to understand it. And in that understanding, to love it more deeply. The days flowed like a quiet stream, and with each sunrise, the king became less like a ruler and more like a student of silence. He no longer needed to control the world outside, for he was beginning to understand the world within. In the silence, he met the restless child of his own mind, and instead of rejecting it, he held it gently. The monks noticed the change. His steps were lighter. His gaze rested longer on the sky. He began to bow, not out of protocol, but from a place of humility. He no longer asked questions. He listened, and in his listening, he discovered the sacredness of presence. A fallen leaf, a drop of water, a bird's call, each became a teaching, a Dharma moment. One morning, as he sat beneath an old tree, he whispered to the wind, "So this is what it means to be alive." No audience, no throne, just him and the breath of the earth. He did not need answers anymore. The questions themselves had softened into peace. He recalled the monk's words. True understanding begins when the mind grows quiet. Now he grasped their meaning. Words had once been his shield and sword, but now silence had become his sanctuary. In this sanctuary, he began to forgive himself, his past, even those who had wronged him, not with effort, but with the effortless grace that comes when the heart is still. Stillness was not absence, it was fullness, and he was finally ready to receive it. He began waking before the first light, long before the chants echoed through the monastery walls. The darkness no longer felt empty, it felt sacred. In those early hours, the king would sit beneath the moon's retreat, letting the cool air caress his skin, letting silence cradle him like a mother. There was no need to chase thoughts anymore. They passed like clouds across an open sky, formless, impermanent, beyond control. He observed them, neither clinging nor pushing them away. He had become the sky, no longer the storm. Meditation was no longer something he tried to do. It was who he was becoming. He began to sense the subtle rhythms of life, the breath of the wind, the hush of the trees, the invisible song beneath all things. He did not just see with his eyes, he perceived with his presence. This stillness didn't make him less aware of the world. It made him see it more clearly, without the veil of expectation or fear. When he finally spoke again, his voice was different, gentler, deeper, measured, not because he rehearsed it, but because it rose from still waters. He found himself speaking only when silence had finished teaching. The monks watched with quiet respect. They had seen this transformation before. the cracking of the shell, the birth of the inner lotus. The king had not found answers. He had found a way of being, and in that being, he realized, peace isn't something you find, it's something you remember. As the final days approached, the king no longer counted them. Time had softened into something fluid, less a ruler, more a river. He walked slowly through the monastery gardens, not to get somewhere, but to be where his feet already were. Every step became a prayer, every breath a silent bow to life. The monks never interrupted him, they observed, not as servants watching a king, but as witnesses to a man shedding his armor. In silence, the king learned what his advisors and generals never taught him, that presence is more commanding than power, and humility stronger than pride. He found joy in simple things, the rustling of bamboo, the sound of a ladle dipping water, the faint smell of incense carried by the breeze. These small moments, once drowned in noise, now shimmered like gold flakes on a still pond. In this quiet, nothing was missing. No ambition tugged at him. No fear whispered threats. He simply existed, fully alive. The monk who had guided him remained. Nearby, saying little, only watching. His eyes held the same depth as a mountain lake. When the king looked into them, he saw not judgment, but space, a vastness that welcomed him home. He felt no need to explain himself. His silence said everything. One morning, as the sun rose slowly over the misty hills, the king whispered, "I thought I came here to escape my restlessness, but now I see. I came here to meet myself." The monk smiled gently and replied, "The self you meet in silence is the only self that ever mattered." In the stillness that followed, the king no longer sought answers. He listened, not with his ears, but with his whole being. The breeze through the trees, the creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet, even the distant chant of a monk in the meditation hall. Each sound became a thread, weaving him into the present moment. He sat beneath a Bodhi tree in the courtyard, not seeking enlightenment, but honoring the ground beneath him. His palms rested on his knees, facing upward, open to the sky, not asking for anything, only receiving what was already there. A quiet pulse of life, steady and eternal. The monk approached once more and asked softly, "What do you hear?" The king paused, smiled faintly, and replied, "Everything and nothing." "Yes," the monk said, "when the noise within you ends, the whole world speaks." In that moment, the king finally understood the deeper lesson of silence. It was not the absence of words, but the presence of awareness, not a withdrawal from life, but a merging with it. Every silence held a message. Every still moment was a doorway to deeper clarity. He no longer feared the quiet. It no longer reminded him of loneliness or failure. It had become his companion, his teacher, his mirror. And within that silence, he saw something he had never noticed before. His own heart, beating not for glory, not for power, but simply to love, to live, to be. And that he knew deeply was more than enough. The following morning, the king did not rise as a ruler, but as a man reborn. He bowed before the rising sun, not as a subject of duty, but as a witness to the miracle of simply being alive. The light filtered through the trees like soft prayers, and he let it touch his face without resistance, without expectation. He walked slowly through the monastery grounds, no longer lost in thought, but present with each breath. He felt the earth beneath his feet, the cool morning air against his skin, the rustle of leaves like a gentle voice calling him inward. Every step was a meditation, every inhale a surrender, every exhale a return. Later that day, the monk placed a small bowl before the king and said, "Fill this not with food, but with understanding. What have you gathered?" The king looked into the empty bowl and replied, "That the silence I once feared has become the most honest part of me. That without it, I spoke to be heard. Now I remain quiet to listen." The monk nodded. "You have learned the true purpose of words, not to command, not to impress, but to express the truth that arises from stillness." The king closed his eyes for a moment, and in the space between that breath and the next, he felt no need to speak, no urge to explain. The bowl remained empty, and yet it was full, for sometimes what teaches most is what cannot be spoken. The days that followed, the king no longer asked for advice. He simply stayed, walking in the garden, sweeping leaves, sharing tea with the monks in silence. The questions that once tormented him had faded, not because they had been answered, but because they had lost their urgency and their grip on his soul. One evening, as twilight painted the sky with soft hues of blue and amber, the monk approached him and said, "Your heart is quieter now. Do you hear it?" The king listened, not with ears, but with presence. "Yes," he whispered, "it no longer beats in fear, but in rhythm with everything." The monk smiled gently. When the mind falls still, the world speaks through everything. The wind carries teachings. The stones remember peace. Even your own breath becomes scripture if you truly listen. The king watched a single leaf drift down from a tree, spinning softly before it landed. It was not a grand revelation, yet it moved him more than all the counsel he had received in court. In its still descent, he saw the nature of surrender. Then, "What now?" the king asked. The monk placed a hand on his shoulder. "Now you return, not to rule louder, but to live deeper, not to speak more, but to speak true. Carry silence with you, not as absence, but as sacred space." That night, the king sat alone beneath the stars. He no longer feared the darkness. He no longer needed to fill it with words, for he had found the place where stillness begins and where suffering ends. The stars blinked overhead like silent watchers of eternity. The king remained seated beneath their gaze, unmoving, untouched by the passage of time. What had changed in him could not be named, but it was felt, like the warmth of dawn before the sun rises. The monk approached once more, not to teach, but to remind. True silence is not merely the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything. When you carry that silence within, you become a sanctuary for others. The king nodded, and for the first time in his life, he did not feel the need to respond with words. His being had become the answer. The path back to the palace would be long, but his footsteps would echo differently now. Not rushed, not restless, but rooted in stillness. He would sit among ministers with the calm of a mountain. He would listen to complaints with the patience of trees. He would speak only when his words were soaked in presence. The monk bowed to him and said, "You have seen the truth, now live as if it is real. You, dear listener, are invited to do the same. Set aside a moment each day to return to your breath, to sit in silence, to observe the world without rushing to change it. Let that become your refuge. If this story stirred something in you, share it. Let its silence ripple outward. And if your heart whispers to return here, do. The Dharma is always waiting, quiet, patient, alive within you.